Good afternoon. I'd like to start our program today. I'm Gyuk Shin. I'm Director of Assurance and APAC, and also it's a Korea program. So I'd like to welcome all of you to this last colloquium for Korea program this quarter and actually this year. We are very happy to have excellent experts on North Korea. So let me briefly introduce our speakers, and then we can go from there. So we have two speakers. One is Professor Benjamin Young at the right. So he's currently Assistant Professor of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness at Virginia Commonwealth University. I didn't even know that there's such a department at university. But when we learned news that Hamas dug tunnels, and I immediately thought about tunnels in Korea because North Koreans are very famous for digging tunnels, and I thought about his book, Guns, Guerrillas, and the Great Leader, North Korea and the Third World. So if you're interested in nuclear proliferation or some military proliferation by North Korea, this is a great book that I do recommend. And my second speaker is Dr. Yong Suk. He's now Director of Global Risk Analyst for Google's Global Security and Resilience Services. So he served in CIA for more than 20 years. I have some very senior people at the agency who are saying that Dr. Lee was the best analyst on North Korea ever at the agency. So I'm very happy to have you. And then our discussant today is Ria Loy. She's now a Hoover Fellow at the Hoover Institution. So she is a historian studying modern Korea and East Asia. Her doctoral dissertation, now she is working as a book right now, examines the intellectual and cultural history of North Korea in the context of Japanese Empire's legacy, as well as the influence of the revolutionary bloc. Okay, so today our topic is North Korea foreign policy under three Kims, insight into the DPRK's foreign relations. So what we're going to do is that each speaker, Ben and Yong Suk, will be speaking about for 15 minutes each, and then Ria will discuss about 10 minutes, and then I'll maybe moderate discussions among us for maybe 15 minutes, and then we'll open up to the audience. Okay, so we're going to start with Ben. So let's welcome all our speakers.
First of all, thank you for having me here today at Stanford. I've actually been to Palo Alto before. My brother-in-law lives over in Santa Clara, so I was also able to meet with him last night. So it's been a really great trip. So today I'm going to talk to you a bit about history, but also transitioning into the contemporary period. During the Cold War era, the North Korean leadership saw their country as both a developmental model to small nations in the Third World, as well as a member of the socialist bloc. This dual identity allowed North Korea to reap the benefits of Sino-Soviet competition, while also competing with South Korea for diplomatic recognition in the decolonizing world. Today, global geopolitics revolve around great power competition between China and the U.S. Meanwhile, revisionist power in Moscow threatens the U.S.-led international order. So North Korea, they've all but abandoned its Cold War-era foreign policy of solidarity with small nations and now seeks to cozy up with, quote, the big nations, particularly Russia. This is an important shift in the grand strategy of the Kim family regime and should not be discounted by policymakers in Washington and Seoul. So I'm going to take you from the Kim Il-sung period briefly to Kim Jong Il and then to Kim Jong Un. So from the 1960s to the 80s, North Korea devoted a considerable amount of financial resources to establishing diplomatic relations with newly independent countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. This effort was due to inter-Korean competition. The two countries adhered to a version of the German-style Halsten doctrine, where if a foreign government identified a particular Korean government as a legitimate representative of the peninsula, the other Korea would not establish relations with that government. This diplomatic contest resulted in North and South Korean diplomats jet-setting from far-flung nations in the Pacific to newly independent countries in sub-Saharan Africa. During the course of my archival research, I actually came across a document at the British National Archives where there was a North Korean diplomat jet-setting all across the South Pacific, even visiting these micro-island nations like Nauru. And then immediately afterwards, there was a South Korean diplomat who also went on a plane and went to these same small micronations. This is how important this competition was to both Seoul and Pyongyang. So North Korea's founding leader Kim Il-sung, and I actually did an AI-generated image here of him. And so North Korea's founding leader Kim Il-sung, he understood that small countries had influence in international forums, chiefly the United Nations. They wanted the international community to recognize Pyongyang as the legitimate government of the entire Korean peninsula. At immense cost to itself, North Korea established embassies and diplomatic missions in a wide range of third world countries. Ideologically, North Korean leadership under Kim Il-sung saw themselves as a leader of the third world movement. As a small country that had once experienced foreign colonial occupation, Kim Il-sung understood the risks and challenges that great powers pose to small countries. This deeply ingrained anti-colonial sentiment meant that the North Korean leadership had natural sympathy for other small countries with histories of colonialism and foreign occupation. So while almost imaginable today, North Korea once donated technical assistance and material aid to many developing countries during the Cold War eras. Oftentimes, North Korea's involvement in third world development and national liberation struggles came at a direct financial cost to the Kim family regime. Obviously, we don't know the exact figures of how much the North Korean leadership spent on its escapades in the third world, but I'm pretty sure it was a heavy cost. So, however, anti-colonial solidarity and a firm belief in national independence undergirded these efforts. So in addition to some of the AI-generated images that I came up with, here are some actual North Korean propaganda posters. So this is from Leiden University's library. And I think this North Korean propaganda poster here it's actually very, very unique because you rarely see anything but Korean on a propaganda poster. And so you have Arabic writing on there. And I was actually told by an Arabic speaker that it's not a very good, accurate translation. But this is something that you would see during the Cold War era, this multiracial anti-imperialist front. You almost see nothing like this anymore in North Korea's cultural production. So North Korea's solidarity with small countries, it came to a forefront of its foreign policy during the late 1960s. North Korea saw Cuba, Vietnam, and itself as the three pillars of global revolution and the true torchbearers of anti-colonialism. In 1968, the Cuban foreign minister actually called this the Great Triangle in world politics. He said that these three countries were the sole and real manifestations of armed revolution. So North Korea had this ability to have one foot in the anti-colonial third world and the other foot in the socialist second world. And this allowed Pyongyang to reap economic and political benefits. So within the socialist bloc, North Korea received favorable trade conditions with the Soviet Union. So while Pyongyang was not formally a member of the Soviet-led Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, which is the long word for what is popularly known as Comecon, Moscow's bilateral trade accounts with the North Korean government, it was actually held in subsidized Comecon ruble prices, despite the fact that the DPRK was not a member of this organization. And during the 1980s, the Soviet Union was North Korea's largest trade partner and accounted for 1/3 of the DPRK's overall foreign trade. And this is a look at the Cold War era, kind of how North Korea saw itself as part of this international proletarian movement. You have a Chinese volunteer soldier reading a book about the Soviet Union with a DPRK soldier. So I'm going to briefly now move on to the Kim Jong Il period. And so, as I've talked about, during the Cold War, Pyongyang, they cleverly played the two communist giants, the USSR and China, off of each other. They constantly tilted back and forth between a pro-Chinese and a pro-Soviet line. The North Koreans used their own unique geopolitical position to gain a competitive advantage amidst the socialist rivalry. During the Cultural Revolution, Kim Il-sung worried that the chaos and anarchy would spill over into DPRK. And amidst China's embrace of market reforms in the 1980s and opening of trade ties with South Korea, Pyongyang reverted back to Moscow's orbit during the 1980s. But as we all know, the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, and North Korea shifted much of its foreign trade to China. The rapid economic rise of China had given North Korea a new economic outlet, a much-needed trade partner. North Korea firmly implanted itself within China's political orbit and took advantage of a rapidly growing Chinese economy. Despite the end of the Cold War, North Korea still maintained diplomatic relationships and even created new partnerships with a host of third world countries. For example, amidst the mass famine of the 1990s, known in North Korea as the Arduous March, North Korea established diplomatic ties with post-apartheid South Africa. Kim Jong Il still maintained North Korea's active presence in the non-aligned movement and believed in alternative global venues that prioritized the vantage points of governments in the global south, such as the G77. So despite his buffoonish appearance and lack of charisma, Kim Jong Il was a widely political operative who did not fully trust the Chinese. It is notable that one of Kim Jong Il's first public appearances was a 1961 speech to students at Kim Il-sung University entitled "Worshipping Big Powers and Depending on Foreign Forces is the Way to National Ruin." In the speech, Kim Jong Il stressed that the worship of big countries has a long history in Korea, and that he considered this an ideological malady that needed to be rectified. And during Kim Jong Il's reign, North Korean spokesmen spoke privately that they did not fully trust the Chinese. Some within the DPRK leadership likely disliked the immense economic and political pull that the Chinese were now having within the country. After Kim Jong Il's death, Kim Jong Un internally ran the DPRK in a similarly dictatorial and autocratic fashion. He purged threat to his rule, such as his uncle Jang Sung-taek, as well as killing his half-brother Kim Jong-nam in a Malaysian airport with a WMD-grade nerve agent. However, COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine presented unforeseen opportunities for the North Korean leader. So first, the pandemic allowed Kim Jong-un to reinforce ideological control over the entire governmental apparatus, including the foreign ministry. Strict border measures meant that North Korean diplomats would be stranded abroad for more than 3 years or isolated at home in the DPRK. Due to this development and the rising cost of paying rents for the embassies abroad, Kim Jong-un may have reconsidered the importance of North Korea's many embassies in the global south and the risk of DPRK diplomats defecting abroad, such as the notable case of former DPRK ambassador to the UK, Tae Young-ho. In the last 2 years, North Korea has shuttered 9 of its embassies. Most of these are in Africa, Libya, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Uganda, Angola, Senegal, Guinea, in addition Bangladesh, Spain, and Nepal. So this is remarkable, considering the immense amount of time and resources that Kim Il-sung, his grandfather, put into developing these diplomatic relationships and establishing embassies throughout the third world. Cuba actually established diplomatic relations with Seoul in February of this year. This all but spells the end of North Korea's Third Worldist Solidarity Project and is a firm reminder of how far South Korea has come in overtaking Pyongyang as the preferred Korean partner for most foreign governments. I actually went to Cuba in early January. My hotel was like a 3-minute walk from the DPRK embassy. So I went over there quite a bit and said hello to my friends over there. And it was completely dark, shuttered. It was not active at all, and even my host told me that he used to see the North Korean diplomat walk every day to the embassy, and he doesn't see them anymore. So these embassies, even the one in Cuba, which is a fraternal partner of North Korea, they're just not as active as they used to be. And I think this tells us about a change in North Korea's external behavior. Secondly, Russia's war in Ukraine allowed North Korea to wean itself off of near total economic dependence on China. Russia's military needed weapons and ammo for their illegal invasion of Ukraine. The North Koreans filled this vacuum and supplied much needed ammunition and short-range ballistic missiles to the Russians. There has been a conscious tilting back to the Russian political orbit for the North Koreans. This was made apparent when a group of Russian tourists were among the first group of foreigners to travel to the DPRK in February 2024 after more than 3 years of complete border shutdowns. So Russian tourists arrived in the DPRK before most foreign ambassadors as well as humanitarian aid workers, which should tell you something about how North Korea sees Russia these days. Moreover, Russia's defense minister Sergei Shoigu here, he attended a North Korean military parade in summer 2023, and he was actually pictured clapping for the nuclear weapons display. Russia ostensibly abides by the UN resolutions calling for the denuclearization of North Korea. So this was a complete change in Russia's behavior. So Kim Jong Un, his disregard for small countries and his embrace of big countries, which is the terminology that North Korea has used in their own state media, is a new foreign policy approach for the North Korean regime. As a socialist state with deeply held beliefs about national sovereignty and anti-great powerism, Kim Jong Un is likely playing off pro-Chinese and pro-Russian voices within the upper echelon of the party state. This is somewhat similar to the dynamics of the Chosun dynasty, when pro-Russian, pro-Japanese, and pro-Chinese factions competed for influence within the governing court. Kim Jong Un seems to be becoming more of a Russophile than his father, and this cozying up to Putin's regime will surely help prop up the fledgling post-COVID-19 North Korean economy. It remains to be seen how much closer Pyongyang and Moscow will get in the next few years, but I would not be surprised if formal military treaties and economic agreements are signed between the two leaderships. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. I'm dating myself a little bit. I am proud of myself that I actually had written this in longhand on a legal pad. And I thought, well, you know what, I should at least make an effort to type it. So I did, sitting down because I didn't prepare PowerPoints. I just want to say one thing about Dr. Young here, since he's not going to advertise himself. His book, Guns, Guerrillas, and the Great Leader, about North Korea, how they exported revolution to a third world country, I told him, it's easily one of the best books on North Korea I read the last 20 years. So really fantastic. So, and please. When I learned of it, I downloaded it right away on Kindle, at a reasonable price. And if you do that, and if you purchase this book, you'll be supporting Stanford University because it's Stanford University Press, right? So really kudos to you.
What about her dissertation?
Oh, yeah. The succession, the Kim Jong Il, Kim Jong Un succession. I mostly had Korea jobs. One non-Korea job I had. I was a briefer on the President's Daily Briefing staff. I remember that morning briefing the possible. It was a possible health crisis that Kim Jong Il would have suffered, and I remember President Bush like, "So who's in charge?" And he's like, "Chang Song-tak," and I said, "Without wishful thinking." So really look forward to your dissertation. So thank you for the warm welcome and this opportunity to visit the Asia Pacific Research Center today. My name is Yang Lee, and I'm very glad to be here with all of you today. I wear many hats, and I'd like to first let you know about the hats that I am not wearing today. I'm not here representing my employer, Google. Remarks today are my personal opinions based on my previous academic and U.S. government work experience, and they're not related to my current work. Secondly, my post-employment agreement requires that my remarks go through the Publication Review Board, the CIA's Publication Review Board. And although it's been cleared by the Publication Review Board for public presentation, they do not represent the good people of the Publication Review Board. Wanted me to remind you, they do not represent the views of the United States government. I served with the CIA from January 1997 to March 2019. It was pretty awesome, and I loved it every day. But however, I'm retired and no longer affiliated with the U.S. government or CIA. I'm just one of the many former employees who still love the agency and feel really extremely honored to have the opportunity to serve this great country for 22 years. Finally, I want to start by also thank another great institution, the Hoover Institution here at Stanford University, where I'm a visiting scholar this academic year. It's been a fantastic experience, and I really sincerely appreciate Hoover and Stanford for giving me this opportunity this academic year. So my favorite quote about North Korea comes from Kurt Campbell, the Deputy Secretary of State. So back in the days, way back in the 1990s, Kurt was a DASD, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense under the Clinton administration. And he once described North Korea's policymaking as picking the least worst options in a warehouse full of bad options. They're all bad, just what's the least worst option? And 8 decades after the end of the Korean War, the opinions at the warehouse, it's just getting worse. I recently read a great book titled North Korea and the Global Nuclear Order, When Bad Behavior Pays, by Oxford historian Edward Howell. And the title of this book pretty much sums up my experience covering North Korea in the US government. North Korea and the Global Nuclear Order traces the history of North Korea's nuclear program and its negotiations with the US. How Edward Howell describes North Korea's strategy as strategic delinquency and asks the question how North Korea has become a nuclear-armed state and how we might account for its behavior over the last 30 years. Strategic delinquency. That is such an amazing phrase, and it's a perfect description of North Korea's foreign policy strategy. They're deliberately bad because people give them stuff. Howell argues that Pyongyang has benefited materially and socially from delinquency and by flouting international norms. Pyongyang is able to get away with this bad behavior because it's convinced the world that it will follow through with its threats to drown its neighbors in a sea of fire. If the US and its allies try to forcibly disarm the regime, that it will drown its neighbors in a sea of fire, That will drown its neighbors in a sea of fire if the US and its allies try to forcibly disarm the regime. The North's strategic credibility goes hand in hand with its strategic delinquency. They're able to get away with it because we either believe them or we decide we can't take the chance that they're bluffing. The US and its allies may have overwhelming military advantage over the North, but Pyongyang's managed to erode that strategic lead by developing and perfecting 1940s, 1950s era nuclear weapons and liquid fuel missiles. A policymaker once asked me, how many nuclear weapons does it have? And toward the end, I thought this was toward the end of my career, 2018, 2019. And I just thought it was a pointless question. So I was on my way out, so I kind of gave a flippant answer. I said, how big is the North Korean nuclear arsenal? He says, big enough to ruin your day. I grinned and I cringed reading Edward Howell's book. Some of my former colleagues may see the book as a vindication of their analysis that Pyongyang lied and cheated for 30 years. And while intelligence analysts can feel proud for telling truth to power, these kind of facts and hard-nosed analysis really doesn't help policymaking. It doesn't really help them come up with new solutions or make military action in the Korean Peninsula any more palatable. Any smug satisfaction analysts may have quickly dissipates if you think about the fact that North Korea has conducted 6 nuclear tests, is a nuclear power, and regularly tests its missile delivery systems. How far can all-source intelligence analysis help policymakers discern North Korea's threats? How much assurance can the intelligence community provide? And how are our leaders supposed to balance threats of delinquency with possible loss of tens of thousands of lives and trillions of dollars in damage to one of the most populous corners of the world? Regardless of who wins the 2024 presidential election, let's see how that goes. One thing for sure, North Korea policy, Washington's choices remain the least worst options in a warehouse full of bad options. So what can we do? Well, I have no idea. I like to tell people I am 53 years old, and I've been studying North Korea professionally since I was 22. So 31 years, and 22 of them in the CIA. If I was going to come up with a silver bullet solution to kill this big bad wolf, I think it would happen by now. I think it's time to give the new generation of North Korea watchers a chance. And all I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to give back now to the community of Korea watchers and pass on lessons that I learned during my career. There are many lessons, but today I just want to share with you what I consider my top 5. The first lesson I learned is the importance of allies. North Korea policymaking works best when the US moves in lockstep with South Korea and Japan. Longtime Korea watcher Scott Schneider recently published a great Council on Foreign Relations book titled US-South Korea Alliance, Why it May Fail and Why It Must Not. And I'm starting to think that my talk is becoming like a book review. I have 2 cats and I read a lot. That's basically my life. It's a great reminder that we cannot take for granted one of America's most important alliance relationships in the world. I would add Japan to this calculus as well. Our United States relationship with South Korea and Japan absolutely is the iron triangle that forms the basis from which US national security policy will advance in Asia. Unfortunately, this doesn't always happen because the stars do not always align. Relations with North Korea and Japan are hotly contested ideological issues in South Korean politics. Progressives favor conciliation with North Korea. They distrust US motives, sees North Korea as just an excuse for US to continue to maintain troops on the Korean Peninsula, and really sees Japan as a bigger enemy than North Korea. While conservatives in South Korea see North Korea as the main enemy or pro-US and are willing to shelve historical grievances with Japan for the sake of forming a strong unilateral united front. So the current atmospherics between Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo, where the stars are aligned, that's rare. And unfortunately, with so many crises going on in the world, I think we're missing an opportunity to really take full advantage of that. The second lesson I learned is relations between China and North Korea, which I think is a classic case study in tyranny of the weak. China has fate control, but it does not have behavior control over North Korea. US policymakers, Republican, Democrat, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, US policymakers instinctively try to get Beijing to control Pyongyang's behavior, and this never works. Absolutely, Beijing can shut the border with North Korea and try to starve North Korea into submission, but why? Why should China do any favors for the United States during this point in US-China relations? And why should Chinese leaders voluntarily invite instability on their border? If we step back and think about it in terms of world history, what patron state controlled 100% their client state? I can't imagine dealing with Chiang Kai-shek, Ngo Dinh Diem, or Park Chung-hee was any less painful for the United States in the 50s and 60s. Would Washington have risked instability with one of its client states during the Cold War if we perceived it only advanced Moscow's interests? I don't think so, and that's what we're asking the Chinese to do constantly, or that's their perspective. The third lesson that I learned is that the United States, we are fooling ourselves if we think we're deterring North Korea. We're not. North Korea is winning the deterrence game because they know the US playbook stops short of military action. When North Koreans kill or wound South Koreans, Washington's response is very predictable. We say, our cabinet officials say things like, both sides needs to calm down. Remember, South Koreans just lost citizens, and we say both sides needs to calm down. You can only imagine what a reaction in Seoul is. And we send high-ranking civilian and military officials to Seoul to really twist South Korea's arm not to respond militarily. I think the best example of this is following North Korea bombardment of Yeonpyeong Island, YPDO, in November 2010. Pyongyang used as an excuse a South Korean Marine Corps artillery exercise that was going on at the time, even though the South was deliberately firing away from North Korea to avoid any misunderstanding. When President Lee Myung-bak of South Korea made the decision that they're going to finish that artillery exercise, that the North Korean provocation interrupted, the level of public pressure the Obama administration placed on South Korea not to do it was frankly stunning. The US instead offered more sanctions against North Korea and B-2, B-52 flyovers. When North Koreans kill South Koreans, it is counting on US to pressure Seoul not to respond militarily. And Washington lives up to and does exactly what Pyongyang predicts every single time. Now, I'm not a policymaker and never have been, but I do wonder about doing the same things over and over again when your adversary already knows your playbook. The fourth lesson I learned is that we underestimate the conservatism and the risk-averse nature of the North Korea's leaders. If South Korea ever responded kinetically to a North Korean provocation, it would absolutely upend their strategic calculus, or what they thought they knew about the American playbook. Some observers fear a South Korean counterstrike into North Korea, killing North Korean soldiers, following a provocation would unleash hell and fury from Pyongyang on Guam, Hawaii, Seoul, and Tokyo. They're kind of the worst case scenario. Really? Why? As far as I can tell, Kim Jong Un is not suicidal. He probably wants what all dictators want, from Assad to Putin, to rule for a lifetime and die peacefully in his own bed. Getting his hand smacked or his nose thwacked in a South Korean counterstrike following a North Korean provocation is not worth bombing Guam and then being chased by JSOC with you and your family's picture on a deck of cards. There is no retirement for Kim Jong Un. There is no book deal, there are no lucrative speech tours or sitting on corporate boards. Either he dies in power of natural causes or he ends up like Mussolini. I started my life as a PhD student in diplomatic history right after the fall of the Soviet Union. And my biggest lesson learned came from early archival work of historians behind the former Iron Curtain. And the biggest lesson learned was the conservatism and fear of successive Soviet regimes, which North Korea is very similar. These regimes are insular, suspicious, and desperately holding on tight to their system or way of life to continue to ensure power and privilege for the few. The fifth and final lesson I learned is that North Korea really believes what it says. I remember how I earlier on said that if South Korea ever struck back against a North Korean provocation that harmed its citizens and just limited attack against the point of origin, that would once again fundamentally shake their view of the world, because South Koreans are not supposed to do that. They're American puppets. They're not. It's the fact that South Korea can make its own independent strategic calculus and act on it is one of those things that fundamentally attacks their view of the world. Professor Kim asked me, not Professor Kim, my apologies. Professor Shin asked me earlier, he thought, I thought you were working on North Korean nuclear proliferation. I have to say, sir, how my thinking about this evolved. I started thinking more and more about North Korean proliferation and nuclear weapons in terms of North Korea's view of the world, so more in terms of strategic culture. And really, it all comes down to North Korea has nuclear weapons because North Korea is a country built on a lie. North Korea's founding father, Kim Il-sung, knew he was lying when he claimed to have liberated the Korean peninsula in a joint military operation with the US and the Soviet Union, but that the US and his South Korean cronies betrayed him. And Kim Il-sung knew he was lying when he claimed that US and South Korea invaded North Korea when in June 1950, he was just sitting around minding his own business. Politicians lying to cover their ass or less savory ass with their personal history, that's nothing new, and that's multicultural and around the world, any country you go to. But what if that lie is an origin myth for an entire country? And what if that lie underpins the country's strategic thinking and its relations with the outside world? Kim Jong Il, who took over North Korea after his father Kim Il-sung died, was only 8 years old when the Korean War started. Did he know his father was lying? Yeah, maybe. But Kim Jong Il, as a young man, also took charge of the propaganda in the country. And he was tasked with, and he sought himself out to try to make his father like a godlike figure. This way, Kim Jong Il also solidified his own political future, right? I mean, who can succeed a godlike figure but the son of God himself? What about the North Korean leader today, Kim Jong Un, the grandson of the founder, born in 1984? Does he know his grandfather was lying? Probably not. Kim Jong Un, for his part, from what he's been taught, probably cannot understand why US leaders, one after another, want to destroy his country. From North Korea's perspective, if your existence every day is being threatened by a superpower villain who is hell-bent on your destruction, and that's all they care about, developing nuclear weapons make perfect sense, and why would you ever give them up? So those are my top 5 lessons learned, and well, so what? Where do we go from here? Well, this is where all of you come in, you two specifically. I'm counting on the current and future Korea scholars to invent a better light bulb. For my part, I'll stay out of your way and try to minimize old stories and starting phrases with, well, back in my day. Thank you again for the invitation, and looking forward to learning from all of you.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for the fascinating talk. So I'd like to go back to the interesting quote by Kurt Campbell, the Deputy Secretary of State. And as you said, Campbell described North Korea policymaking as picking the least worst possible option in a warehouse full of bad options. And you added, after 8 decades since the Korean War, is getting worse. So I must ask, why is this the case? What are we missing in our approach of North Korea? And certainly it would be imprudent to underestimate how difficult and complex it is and challenging it is to engage North Korea. And the reality is that even if we do everything right, even if we prepare for everything, even then it will be very difficult. So, but I think it is important to make a distinction between an impossible task and a very difficult task. And a colleague at Hoover always tells us that we need to reassess our toolkits in foreign relations. And I think the same lesson really applies in the case of North Korea. We need to reassess our toolkits in engaging with North Korea. Now, in particular, I think a missing piece of the puzzle really is language in diplomacy. Language and diplomacy. And so the reason why I bring this up is that recently, a few months ago, a US State Department interpreter who took part in the Trump-Kim Jong Un summit, she recently gave an interview. And she's a very high-level person who took part. And she said during the interpreting from North Korean language to English, she was sweating because she couldn't fully understand the North Korean language. This is a very high-level, important meeting, but what she's saying, she has a point. What I mean by this is that anyone who works on interpreting in North Korea is very difficult, however experienced you are. And whether you're translating from Korean to Japanese or South Korean to even North Korean is very tough. And it is challenging, not because they don't use Korean. Yes, they use Korean, but the language that's used in North Korea is no longer the same Korean that South Koreans are familiar with. And as North Korean specialists would know, the language spoken in North Korea is known as 문화, or cultural language. But wait, when did they start developing this? From the 60s and on to the 70s. So we're missing something, right? But how is the language of North Korea? What does that look like? When we open the lid, you get a very highly politicized language that does take time to get used to. It's not an easy translation. It is not an easy interpreting. But on top of that, what we get is a distinct linguistic etiquette. And more importantly, what is embedded in that cultural language or 문화 in North Korea is that distinct language of the cult. So naturally, if you're going to a meeting and you're going to talk about this is going to be a very important challenge. And this leaves us with an important question. What is lost in that translation, in that diplomacy? And what are the consequences of not getting things right? And I'm not talking about the failure of the Hanoi summit at all, or I'm not talking about track 2 meetings. What I'm talking about is what kind of toolkits and what kind of attitude should we update some of the things or should we abandon some of the things? And in a high-level profile summit meetings like that, it is not surprising that there will be disagreements among the states. Of course, there will be disagreements. That's expected. But being unclear about the very disagreement is a wholly separate matter. The former is impossible. The latter is difficult but doable. So we need to get the latter right. So I think getting the language of the cult, getting the cultural language, how North Korean language diverged from the brand of Korean that is used in South Korea, I think that is an important point. But why? Because as you know, when you're dealing with North Korea, we always wonder, is this a false alarm or is this a signal for genuine change? How do we understand that? Well, the only antidote to that is context, right? Context and language. So let's contextualize the statements. An example I give is in 2019, North Korea called then South Korean President Moon Jae-in 삶은 소대가리. So that, if you translate in English, it's what the entire full translation would be North Korea telling Moon Jae-in that what you're saying is so absurd that even a boiled head of a cow would laugh at such absurdity. So that is certainly offensive. It sounds very strongly worded things. But I realize it is offensive, but we need to contextualize this. In primetime news in, let's say, CNN, BBC, we normally don't hear people swearing. But in North Korean language news, it is not unheard of. So that distinction is important. So if I were somebody focusing on North Korean signals, that swear words, I think it's important, but it's not as useful as what Kim Jong Un is doing right now. What is he doing right now? He's trying to scrap the term Day of the Sun. Day of the Sun is the one that refers to his grandfather, commemorating his grandfather. Is North Korea changing the language of the cult? That is an important signal we need to focus on. So I think, so in a way, I think people sometimes say you need to decenter the leader, you need to go away from the leadership. But I actually think what we need more than ever is to squarely confront North Korea for what it is. And language and diplomacy is very useful because it helps us distinguish false alarm versus genuine change. And once we do that, we can really make the distinction between unwarranted wishful thinking. And wishful thinking alone is not a bad thing, but wishful thinking combined with blind, dangerous optimism can often come with consequences that we don't want. So I wonder later, maybe you can elaborate on how this has been dealt with within the intelligence community and whether we should reassess our toolkits. And if so, what should be our priorities? What are the tools that worked in the past but doesn't work anymore? And to Dr. Young's fascinating talk on how North Korea's policies shift from small countries to big countries, I think that's really persuasive. It's so true. And, but I was also thinking at the same time, another way of looking at this of North Korea is, or perhaps a provocative question to really ask is North Korea really following the great powers? Or could we say that, in a way, North Korea is a pioneering case in some regards in foreign policy? And what I mean by that is North Korea still has this unusual political resilience, right? And I studied the history of succession in North Korea. And in the case of the Soviet Union, the transition of power was not always clear-cut, right? To the question after Lenin, well, after Stalin, what, who? But even if we zoom out now.
What about after Putin?
Exactly. So that's exactly the question I was going to ask. After Putin, what? Or after Putin, what kind of Russia? Same question to China. After Xi Jinping, who? After Xi Jinping, what kind of China? But as someone who studies history of succession, and I'm sure others will agree that North Korea somehow managed to get the succession right, the transition right. So, and does North Korea then, rather than being a pale imitation of an authoritarian model, is it presenting a new story? Are we seeing something new? And recently, and I was thinking about this, but then recently, Stephen Kotkin published a new article in the Foreign Affairs, The 5 Futures of Russia. And in one of the options, one of the scenarios, he mentions, is Russia following the North Korean model? Of course, comparing Russia and North Korea, can we compare it or not? That's a separate debate. But I think it's an interesting question. So although North Korea has ties with China, as you mentioned, it is also true that China doesn't have full control, right? Anyway, North Korea gets away with so many things, like the killing of the half-brother Kim Jong Un, right? So North Korea is not under the thumbs of one great power. Does North Korea now present a novel model of a liberal state in the international order? Is North Korea now a pioneer in some ways? This, I think, will be an important question, whether it is, in the coming months, whether it is Biden or Trump. And in that regard, Dr. Young, in the talk, I was thinking whether if you could elaborate further on North Korea's move aligning with the small countries to the big great powers. But I would be quite curious to know, because we had Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong Il, and Kim Jong Un. Are the three leaders shaped by the same fears? And Kim Il-sung, he is a product of the colonial period. Kim Jong Il, he saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. Kim Jong Un grew up in Switzerland. How does that? So, do you think Kim Jong Un is marked by the same fears than his predecessors? How relevant is this in understanding the recent shift in foreign policy? Thank you.
I think there are a lot of fascinating topics on the table. But let me maybe get back to Ben and Young, if you have any response to Ria's comments and questions.
Thank you so much for the questions and your remarks. This thing about the language. At the first time I heard spoken North Korean was at a Korean restaurant in China, in Dandong, China. I had sitting right in front of the Yalu River with North Korea on the other side. And the waitress said something to me. I looked at her and I told her, I don't speak Chinese. And I said this in Korean. And she looked at me and she sighed. She just sighed. and looked at me and just spoke very slowly, word by word in Korean. She was telling me, take the receipt, go pay downstairs. And I had no idea what she was talking about. And that happened This was in the late 90s, early 2000s, Dandong, Shenyang, and area, and it happened again the next night at another. They cornered the market for a while in the 90s and 2000s. You wanted Korean food in Dandong or Shenyang, China. It was they cornered the market on that. Once again, I had no idea what they're saying. After a while, though, you start to catch on, and I've noticed Pyongyang dialect is easier to understand than some of the other places. I don't know where the others were from, but it was just, I literally thought, I'm a native speaker, and I really thought they were speaking Chinese. You got to get used to it. And so definitely, yeah, absolutely, that context is important. I think they speak in metaphors a lot too, like with the boiled ox head. But that's a Chinese characteristic as well. I think there's a famous story of Mao when he was meeting Stalin for the first time, which it turned out that was a meeting where Kim Il-sung attended as well, trying to convince Stalin to back his invasion plan. All Mao told Stalin was, "I want something." I want something that tastes sweet and as well as bitter. I forget the phrase, but just this metaphorical language about using food. So yeah, absolutely, that coded communicative language in North Korea is it's a full-time occupation. I have really highest respect for people who do it for a living. The U.S. government's dating myself again. I guess it's not called FIBIS. It's not called FIBIS anymore. Federal Broadcasting Information Service. I think it's called the Open Source Center now, where generations of Korean translators who just listen to North Korean language. Bob Carlin, and we're talking about Sid Tyler. Like, he's just the way they can dissect that language, and you don't survive in the North Korean political system as a party elite if you can't pick up the daily party paper and know what it means. I mean, literally the whole phrase of criminology, right? The watching Kremlin. And now here at Stanford, I think the late Professor Alexander George was one of the first ones to really pioneer that methodology, I believe, during World War II, looking at Nazi propaganda. So that is a real science, and you really learn quite a bit, and really have the highest respect for those people who do. As what to do different. So the psychologists talk about there's an ideal self and a real self. The U.S. policymakers, and I said this in a piece that was published a while back, saying we need to kind of embrace the fact that we need to embrace the fact that North Korea is a nuclear power. We're not talking. Let's stop kidding ourselves when we talk about denuclearization. We need to start talking about disarmament. I think embracing the fact that cow has escaped the barn a long time ago, and it's not coming back. It's just embrace the facts. I think that's the first step, and I think it starts from that policy discussions need to start with, this is no longer a denuclearization discussion, but it's a disarmament discussion. And it's a whole different protocol. And it's a whole different level of acceptance. I've said this in the past, even during government, and response I always hear is that, then what are you going to do? South Korea and Japan are going to want to have nuclear weapons. I'm thinking, well, if South Korea and Japan if they want to have nuclear weapons, I don't think what's stopping them is successive U.S. administration saying we refuse to recognize North Korea as a nuclear power. They are a nuclear power. And we need to have serious discussions about disarmament, and the biggest risk to the world is the proliferation risks. One thing there's lesson number 6. I will add to you. North Korea has never developed a piece of technology that he didn't try to sell, and just repeated violations of non-proliferation treaties. building a Yongbyon-style nuclear reactor in the middle of the Syrian desert, AQ Khan. And once again, having a realistic discussion about proliferation, counter-proliferation, I think it starts with changing our mind, changing our framework, and saying, how do we deal with North Korea as a nuclear power? And once again, the other thing is, biggest thing is that North Koreans insist on dealing only with the United States, and we let them. A lot of these discussions, people who should be in the driver's seat, it's really Seoul. But North Koreans, because North Koreans insist on speaking only to Washington, we go along with it. And one of the things I always said was, don't be so desperate for dialogue that you let the opposition set the terms. So I live in Boulder, Colorado, where Coach Prime is a big thing. It's like Deion Sanders had this great quote when he was a player about catching the wide receivers off guard. He said he was successful because he was able to catch people off guard. And I think once again, we're not going to be able to invent a better light bulb doing the same thing over and over again. And as Einstein said, I think it was a definition of insanity.
Okay.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for the great comments. There's a lot of things to think about going forward. You brought up one of the points at the end about like the formative moments for Kim Il Sung and Kim Jong Il. For Kim Il Sung, it was the Japanese occupation. It was the Korean War. For Kim Jong Il, it was the collapse of the Soviet Union. But for Kim Jong Un, what are the formative moments? I think right now we're seeing that, and that is the Russian invasion of Ukraine and also the Israel-Palestine conflict. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think what he's seeing now is perhaps the creation of a different international order where sanctions don't matter and you can reap massive economic benefits. And you also don't have to depend on China so much. And as far as Israel-Palestine conflict, you get more buyers for your weapons, for your arms. I would not be surprised if we start seeing North Korean armaments ending up for the so-called Islamic resistance militias in Iraq or with the Houthis. We know that North Korea has tried to sell missiles to the Houthis before. There's many, many potential buyers now in the Middle East. And they have intermediaries in Syria with Bashar al-Assad and in Iran, who is one of their old comrades. So I think right now, I would say those are the formative moments. With Kim Jong Un, there's a lot of like absurdities, right? The Dennis Rodman trip, like that captures the American imagination because it seems like something out of a silly novel. Even the summits with Donald Trump seem somewhat absurd, right? But what we're seeing now is a really big indication of where Kim Jong Un is going. For example, he's gotten rid of all this imagery of a unified Korean peninsula. He destroyed the arch for unification. He said this is an eyesore, and then 3 weeks later that thing was down. I mean, those are massive developments in North Korea's ideological tapestry, and I think that should not be discounted because it's coming from the top down. It's coming from the leader himself. And so I think that should signal something. And one thing that I think it signals is that North Korea no longer regards South Korean as fellow countrymen. They're no longer part of the Minjok. They're no longer part of the ethnic nation. So does that mean it's easier to kill people that aren't part of your ethnic race, your ethnic nation? Because, if you're killing someone who you regard as like a brother, it's much more difficult. But if the terminology changes, it makes it easier 5, 10, 20, 30 years down the line to have some sort of military conflict with people that you don't regard as part of your nation, your people. So it'll be interesting to see what goes on after the election because I do think that will shape U.S.-North Korea relations. So I'll just end on that point. Sure.
Let me ask the following. It's a fascinating point about Kim Jong Un and the lessons learned from the Russia-Ukraine and what's going on in Israel-Palestine. You're absolutely right. Beyond his tit for tat with the United States, this is like the biggest political event in his life. What does that mean for stability and security on the Korean Peninsula and U.S.-Korean relations? If you kind of fast forward it. Sorry to I should let the audience.
I mean, those are big questions. I think in regards to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think he actually, to put myself in Kim Jong Un's mind, which is probably a warped place, and it's hard to, this is my supposition. I would say this is actually he's probably seen that Russia's slowly winning this, and he's probably more confident about his own chances of some kind of skirmish on the peninsula. And so, there was a recent article in 38 North by Siegfried Hecker and Bob Carlin, and talking about the chances for all-out war in the peninsula. And I think that article is very important. I know it's been criticized, yada, yada, but I think that article is actually very important. I don't see it as an all-out war taking place. And neither Siegfried Hecker and Bob Carlin, they actually don't make that point as well. But what I do see is something smaller. Perhaps North Korea capturing one of the islands, South Korean islands, that's actually closer to the North Korean mainland than South Korea. Something that can kind of rally people around the flag and won't invite a full-out military conflict. Because at the end of the day, North Korea, they have to motivate their people somehow. You have to have a rally around the flag effect every 5, 10, 20 years. And that time is coming for Kim Jong Un. And so what I see, if I was South Korea, I would really try to bolster defenses on those islands within close to the northern limit line. Because I think that we have seen that North Korea thinks they have a strategic advantage when it comes to targeting some of those islands.
Okay, so I think about 2 months ago, we had Sig and Bob here to talk about their article. And one thing also Sig mentioned was that now, North Korea is supplying some weapons to Ukraine, for Russia. In Ukraine, Sig was saying that it's a great opportunity for North Korea to test their weapons because they didn't have an opportunity to test their weapons actually. So, Sig is a nuclear expert. So in his view, it's a great opportunity to test their weapons. Okay, so going back to maybe Yong's point about North Korea is counting on United States to restrain South Korea from any retaliation. And let's say Sig and Bob saying that North Korea has made a strategic decision to go to war with South Korea. So, let's assume that North Korea attack or trying to take a small island or whatever, and then North Korea, the United States doesn't stick to all the playbook, then let South Korea retaliate. Yeah. So what's going to happen?
Once again, the times when in history, and just from my personal observation, 22 years, the times when North Korea blinked was they were absolutely convinced the U.S. was ready to go to war. They blinked. I think the first time was when 1977, when North Korean border guards murdered 2 U.S. officers at the demilitarized zone. There was the tail end of the Ford administration, and the U.S. was ready to go to war. Said, we're going to cut down those trees. And you had B-52s up. Everybody, the whole peninsula was on war footing. And it convinced North Koreans, and North Koreans blinked and it apologized. Kim Il-sung apologized for this unfortunate incident. The second time I saw that was when I was in government, was 2003. you used to, big part of my job as I was chief of Korea analysis for a long time, and big part of my job is liaison, meeting with foreign governments and briefing them and continuing the partnership. And if you ever meet with the Chinese, they say, well, North Korea and just kind of the whole of government effort and State Department colleagues. This is why we have this expert, they're briefing you, this is why so they're dangerous. And the Chinese would always say, well, no, we don't have any influence, we don't have any influence, we don't have any influence. It's basically saying, just give him what he wants. This was when Kim Jong Il was. Then in 2003, the week Operation Iraqi Freedom kicked off, a North Korean MiG-29 intercepted a U.S. Cobra ball flight over the Sea of Japan. And that was a week, once again, remember, we just kicked off this war in Iraq. We just invaded Iraq. And so, as I said, that week, the United States had a lot of deterrence credibility. And there's a lot of machinations, and it happened very quickly. North Koreans, I think the Chinese wait, and this is one of the things where Chinese show that they have fate control, but not behavior control. And they can just come down on the North Koreans like a ton of bricks. So imagine that they said we have no influence. Just a couple of days after that incident, James Kelly got a phone call from I think it was Woo Da-wei at the time, and from the Chinese and saying, "Come to Pyongyang, North Koreans will be there." I mean, come to Beijing, North Koreans will be here. And Secretary Kelly thought Chinese were just pulling his leg. No, they weren't pulling his leg. It started as what started as a three-party talks. Eventually, a few months later, became the six-party talks. That's how the six-party talks got started. And once again, the threat of going to war was so intense when all sides, China and North Korea, and China was convinced that Kim Jong Il may have gone too far. They put that pressure down, and most recently with President Trump. 2017. Yeah, where Kim Jong Un was pretty convinced that the U.S., well, the South Koreans were certainly convinced that there was about to be some kind of military action. And that level of pressure is what causes North Korea to blink. And once again, if they actually carried it out, South Koreans actually carried it out, retaliated. And you're absolutely right about the islands, because I grew up as a North Korean military analyst, and that's where the North Koreans actually outnumber the South Koreans. It's so far ahead. It is almost impossible to try to resupply those islands. It would completely rock their world. And Kim Jong Un at that point would just have two choices: do you escalate, or do you back down? I don't think he will escalate. If he escalates, events beyond that is beyond his control. He loses that escalatory initiative.
Any comments?
I mean, there's a lot to think about there. I think in terms of the islands, I think that what we have seen is that North Korea has invested quite heavily in their navy. There was Kim Jong Un. He was touring that hydrogen-powered submarine, and that was pictured in the North Korean state-run media. That tells you something. That tells you that they regard this as important. Kim Jong Un, when he's pictured visiting a military facility, and they also featured this on the front page of their state-run media. I mean, that's something to consider. And one of the points that Young made that I think is really important is we tend to we tend to not think that the North Koreans believe in their own propaganda and ideology. It's just like this silly ideology. They don't really care about it. Like the Soviets didn't really care about the ideology. They weren't real communists. I think the North Koreans, because of just the amount of political indoctrination, it has seeped in. Like this is part of their strategic calculus and their mindset. Like that they regard South Koreans as U.S. puppets. And I think that we should not discount that effect on how they make decisions.
And you hear that a lot from North Korean defectors. If you interview North Korean defectors, and they go through a South Korean government-sponsored interview process. Most of it's process trying to figure out whether actually they're legit defectors or they're trying to infiltrate South Korea. And one of the things is like a lot of them have colored hair. A lot of them, they know all the popular Korean movies and popular Korean songs. And they said, yeah, I mean, that's and use the kind of the Korean slangs among the North Korean young people just going on inside North Korea. And so they know all this, and this is what eventually a conclusion that I came to. It's like, yeah, if you're, it's like I read a lot about, pick a country, but or a planet. You read a lot about the moon. You read a lot about the Apollo 11 mission, but can you actually imagine what that is? So there's part of it, that psychological barrier of when it's all you know. It just seems kind of unreal that this is real. It's one thing to say this is entertainment and you're entertained by it, but it's another to commit and understand this is real and this is where I want to be. I think what's missing is that theoretical conceptualization of that idea of shared dreams about what is freedom, what is democracy, when all you've known your life was just hand to mouth existence, right? Yeah.
Then I'll open to the floor, and this is to any or all of you. We talked about succession. I think lately, Kim Jong Un's daughter, a teenager, she appeared with Kim Jong Un in a military parade and and missile testing. So what do you make of this? Is it just part of propaganda, or she might be legitimate successor to Kim Jong Un?
I personally thought it was like the weirdest ever. Missile launches are pretty dangerous. Things blow up sometimes. North Koreans missiles blow up a lot and take your little kid to it. One of the moments that I focus on, I don't know if this is going to be part of your research, and I'm sure it's part of your research that you'll cover in your research, is after the death of Kim Jong Il, I believe, I'm gonna get the timeline right. Kim Jong Un, you start here the bloodline, this talk of the bloodline. I've heard the talk of the bloodline before, but to my recollection, it was the first time that I can remember talking about basically saying only of the pure revolutionary blood, the Kim family blood, can defend the revolution. So when people ask about who's following Kim Jong Un, I says, well, it's easy to say probably one of the family members, right? But it's and there's utilitarian value for that. If you're a North Korean elite, it's you don't want to end up in a South Korean tribunal. You don't want to end up as poor South Koreans in some kind of a camp. It's best that you just kind of support what you know. I think it. But once again, they meant what they said, that you'll come from the bloodline, and you're starting to see the beginning of that. Doesn't mean that it's going to stay that way. Doesn't mean that she, the daughter, is going to stay in his favor. But there's been famous female leaders in Korean history. Not the most recent one who got impeached, but going back to the 600s. And so if you see those kind of old historical allegories and illusions, I think then you can maybe start taking it seriously.
You're experts on succession.
Briefly. No, yeah, of course. So I think it goes back to what I was saying about the language. So Kim Jong Il speaks the language of Kim Il Sung, and I have an article coming out on. Language is something I've been thinking about, but what I mentioned about Kim Il Sung, Kim Jong Un is that they look the same. They almost say the very similar things, but they're really marked by very different fears. Kim Il Sung, the colonial period. Kim Jong Il, he saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that kind of changed him as a person. But Kim Jong Un and Kim Jong Il, part of my research is that Kim Jong Il had a paranoia, like complex, that if you are in a socialist, professedly socialist state, how do you do succession without compromising the political legitimacy? How far can you go? And my research shows that actually Kim Jong Il was aware of this. So he had this kind of deep complex. But with Kim Jong Un, what is he doing with the daughter, right? I think a quick answer is that it's too soon to tell. That's the real answer. But it does tell us more about who Kim Jong Un is. Kim Jong Un is not shaped by the same fear that his father had. So his father would have never done that, and then introduced to the world that, oh, this is my daughter. Because of course, every regime, we have internal contradictions, right? But then that's okay. But if you have a major contradiction that kind of goes against the very political legitimacy of the state, the rubric of it, that I think is a different issue. But Kim Jong Un, the daughter is too soon to tell, but I think the sister is playing the bad cop very well.
That's a fascinating point, because if you look at the kind of the biography of the leaders, right, Kim Jong Il, marked by a series of losses at a very young age, losing his mother, losing his younger brother, then a succession battle with a stepmother and a string of step siblings that, if you dig into it, it's like the Game of Thrones, North Korean version. He survived all that to claim the mantle as the eldest son, what he thought was his rightful title. But I think you're absolutely right. Kim Jong Un just went to boarding school in Switzerland. Yeah, and it seems like he's it's like the ideal model of what happens to a child when he's born into all-knowing power and there's no boundaries. So it's definitely not lacking in confidence. That's a fascinating point.
Yeah, I think building off of that, you invite Dennis Rodman to for your own personal a vacation in a way. I mean, that was just so. That whole thing was so absurd. There's a book written by Bruce Cummings, very famous Korea historian. I think he's done so much for the field of Korean studies, but I will say his book called North Korea, Another Country is his worst book. And the reason why I bring this up is because when you have a North Korean leader, when you have a leader who brings his daughter to see a missile test, that is not like another country. I have never. Where else would you see that? And as a relatively new father of a 2-year-old, I always bring up that picture of him and his daughter at a test launch, and I'm just like, this is crazy. Like, she could die. And here you are, parading her in front of these cameras, and that was her coming out party. I mean, it's just absurd. What other leader would do that? I'm not even sure Bashar al-Assad would do that. All this is to say that, we're working with a very unique country. This is not another country. This changes our strategic calculus and how we think about a regime. So I'll leave it on that point.
Yeah, and they have nuclear weapons.
Yeah, the nuclear weapons.
Okay, so we don't have much time left. So I think what I'm going to do, I'll collect 2 or 3 questions all together, then have a final round of answers. So please say who you are, then make very concise question. Yeah. Go back there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Jody. I'm visiting scholar at Center for African Study. I'm a scholar working on China-Africa during the Cold War. I have a question for Benjamin, very quick question. The early DPRK relations with a lot of third world, particularly African countries, rely on personal friendship of these leaders, particularly in the example of Zimbabwe, like Robert Mugabe played a great role in this. So I'm curious about after he was removed from power and then his death, I mean, in terms of this party exchanges between the kind of ruling party, ideological exchanges, and a lot of aid and the other kind of programs that followed up. I would like to know how that kind of shifted when these kind of early generation of leaders died and lost power.
Just at the Carnegie Institution, I wonder, any of the panelists could answer, for these 3 leaders during the entire time that we've watched North Korea, is there any evidence that the happiness function is U-shaped? By which I mean that, of course, as you pointed out, when we arm up and look belligerent, they react. Is there evidence or discussion on the other end of the curve? So if we act mild and, for example, offer agricultural assistance, or I could think of others.
Hi, my name is Gina Sinclair. I'm research assistant to Scott Sagan at CSAC. A couple of months ago, when Sig Hecker and Bob Carlin were here giving a talk, they talked about this concept of strategic empathy. Having had conversations, thrown that term around, I feel like it's gotten a lot of scrutiny. I know you guys talked about how the U.S. doesn't fully understand North Korea. What do you think are the positives and downsides to the U.S. having more empathy towards North Korea and its policy, and how would that kind of manifest itself? Thanks.
Okay, so each of you maybe 1 or 2 minutes to answer. Yeah.
So to take the first question about North Korea-Africa relations, those relationships are so unique because a lot of that comes from North Korea's support of these national liberation struggles in Africa. That North Korea supported SWAPO in Namibia, that North Korea actually supported Nelson Mandela's ANC, that North Korea also supported Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF. And so what we saw is that these relationships have continued even after the death of these leaders, because the party is still in control. Those are still party states. And also the North Koreans, they're not just doing this for their own selfless reasons. There's a lot of money to be made in Africa. So North Korean diplomats have been known to traffic ivory and rhino horns, which is quite profitable considering the market in China. And North Korea is famous for building these huge statues and memorials. And also Africa is ripe for corruption and sanctions evasion. And I think what I read today is that the UN panel of experts for North Korea, that's no more because Russia has officially not signed on to that. And I'm sure the apparatchiks in Pyongyang are very excited about that, they're ecstatic. And I think this will open up a new wave of illicit activities in Africa. But also, this is going to counter what I was talking about in my presentation, that North Korea has shuttered many of those embassies due to rising costs of paying rent, also the possibility of diplomats defecting. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with their embassies and where they actually try to what becomes hubs of North Korean illicit activities. My guess is that the North Korean embassy in Pretoria, South Africa, will be a very rich source of illicit activity for the regime.
Give the last word.
Address that question about strategic empathy. I absolutely disagree. I don't feel like I need to participate in somebody else's delusion. It's a country built on a lie, and I think the worst thing you can do is go along with the lie. It doesn't mean that you have to go to war with them, not that we should somehow try to teach them. No, but I don't feel any need, illusion to go along with the empathy. And I gotta say, 22 years in the agency, just counting the atrocities they commit against their own people. Some reported, some never discussed, not widely reported. And the manner it's done, and the collective punishment for the generations of family members that follow. I have some strong feelings about this regime. Empathy is not one of them. And I think we lose value as human beings. And I think the United States as a nation, my personal view, once again, that when we lose that moral compass.
Okay, thank you so much for our fascinating presentation and discussions. And once again, this is the last colloquium for Korea program. But we're going to have a lot more coming up next year, so hope to see you again. But once again, thank you so much for coming to give your excellent views. Thank you.